This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Áuric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
The harp that once through Tara's halls the soul of music shed, now hangs as mute upon Tara's halls as if that soul were fled. I think many of you, or most of you, will recognize those lines from Thomas Moore, a man who's often called the national bard of Ireland. Whether he be the national bard or not is another matter. But Thomas Moore, a man whom we may call the Minstrel Boy, after one of his own songs, Thomas Moore had an interesting career, only in our last century. So he's not too far removed from us, either in time or perhaps the devotion of the people, for us to forget him so easily. Carry yourselves back to May 28th, 1779. Consider what the situation was like in America. In Europe, things were in a hectic state with respect to several nations. In Ireland, the Protestant volunteers, Grattan's Protestant volunteers, were carrying on their agitation for the freedom of Ireland. And they had indeed, before the end of this century, they had indeed forced upon England the Act of Renunciation, an act passed through the English Parliament whereby England renounced forevermore her claims to Ireland. Such then was the context of the time when Thomas Moore was born, the son of a grocer, in a rather moderate, mediocre section of the city of Dublin. Thomas Moore, a man who shortly was to grace the drawing rooms of many a noble in England. Now, Thomas Moore, although the son of Catholic parents, was one of the first of that religion to enter Trinity College, Dublin, which had been denied, entrance to which had been denied to Catholics for rather a long time before this. When Thomas Moore entered there, he had as his colleagues, his companions, famous names like Robert Emmet, for instance, very well acquainted with Emmet during this time that he was there. On the other hand, Thomas Moore left it and had no further contact with Irish revolutionaries or rebels or political leaders of any sort, barring, of course, a slight connection with Daniel O'Connell in the next century. Thomas Moore, to all intents and purposes, when he took his degree from Trinity College in the spring of 1799 and crossed the Channel to England, to all intents and purposes, he became, it would appear, only another English poet. He was a man of remarkable gifts, social gifts, musical gifts, and perhaps poetic gifts. He was a great favorite in the drawing rooms in England. He sang beautifully, he played beautifully, and he composed in a very delightful manner, composed verses, that is. So he was extremely in demand, shall we say, as the life of the party, and particularly made friends with Lord Moira, M-O-I-R-A. He arrived in England at a very auspicious moment, the beginning, if you will, of English Romanticism. And this Romanticism was marked by two very interesting trends of thought. One was a Grecian and one was an Oriental. There were other aspects to Romanticism too, but these are the ones that interest us with regard to the young Tom Moore. The ex-grocer's son the ex-Trinity College graduate, now the delight of many a drawing room in London, and noticed with a little favor, too, by the Prince of Wales, because his first volume, which was in the Grecian mode, if you will, Anacreontics, was dedicated to the Prince of Wales with the permission of that man. Well, this is extraordinary, isn't it? We have an unknown Irishman landing in London and getting the patronage of royalty when there were other English poets around who would have given a great deal for that honor and that privilege. Through the publication of Anacreontics, his name became widely known. And this, remember, as I said a moment ago, was taking advantage of, or perhaps fitting into it, since he had worked on these before coming to England. He wasn't trying to take advantage of a growing fashion, but he came in at the appropriate time to capitalize all unintentionally upon the growing Grecian interest. So his Anacreontics, songs of love and conviviality, were great favorites in English drawing rooms. He made the acquaintance, I said, of Lord Moira, who procured for Moore a job, a sinecure, in the Bahamas. And in 1803, Moore came to the New World. But the Bahamas hadn't the appeal of the English drawing room. And by nature, he was a very social man, a very convivial sort of person himself. So that he remained in the Bermudas only a few months, and left in his place there a deputy, a man whom he appointed to fill in his place, a deputy as the registrar for the Admiralty. This was an interesting job. You noted the whereabouts of ships and the disposition of prize vessels and all that sort of thing, but it was a position, too, that involved a financial responsibility. And unfortunately for Moore, the man whom he deputized was not so trustworthy as Moore, and cost Moore a frightful sum of money. £6,000 over 100 years ago was quite a sum. But that's another story we'll do for another day. Leaving the Bermudas, he took his quick trip through America, meeting Thomas Jefferson, to whom he was introduced by the English minister, traveling to Niagara Falls, of which he said, by the way, "Oh, bring an atheist here, and he will return no atheist." The falls impressed him quite a bit. So too did the Mohawk and some of the other waters of New York and of Pennsylvania, the Schuylkill, and so on. But he wasn't too much impressed by American Republican manners and frontier dwellings. Even Washington at that time was something of a frontier swamp, we might say. Henry Adams gives us his impressions in The Education of Henry Adams. Moore then went on up to Canada, and as a result of that trip down the St. Lawrence, left us with the Canadian boat song. Some of you may recall the words. Oh, let me see how it goes. Faintly as tolls the evening chime, our voices keep tune, and our oars keep time. This song, which he made to the rhythm of the rather long journey he had by rowboat, 5-day journey by rowboat on the St. Lawrence. Well, he was finished with the New World. He returned to England and to Ireland for a brief visit. But England was to be his home, really. He married a Kilkenny actress, that is, a girl from Kilkenny, Elizabeth Dyke, and he proved to be one of the most devoted husbands we have ever heard about. A remarkable family man, a man who was attentive all his life to his wife. It was really a romance, a storybook romance in that sense. And indeed, we tell the story of the origin of one of his songs. You have all heard, I think, "Believe me, if all those endearing young charms." The story that is told about this is that he returned from a visit one time to find that his wife was ill. to find her screened behind curtains, and to be informed by the maid that she had smallpox. She was being screened to be kept away from the light, but also because she couldn't bear her husband's eyes upon what he had always regarded as one of the most beautiful faces in the world. And therefore, we are told, he composed, "Believe me, if all those endearing young charms, which I gaze on so fondly," etc., you've heard it, were to pass away. So it was his testament to a deeper love than the superficial one of the face. Well, now, Moore, you see, landed in London, became immediately a great success, appointed to the Bermudas, had his trip through the New World, came back now a married man into London society, visiting Lord Moira, Lord Russell, as Lord Byron said, "Tommy dearly loves a lord." So it's true that he was entertained by one lord after another for all of his time in London. Indeed, there's a very funny story in connection with one of these visits. He was visiting Lord Moira and had stayed there, I think it was about 2 weeks, and wanted desperately to go away, but hadn't any money to give the servants for tips, and therefore he couldn't leave until he smuggled a note out to a friend of his, asking him in the name of all desperation to please send him some money so that he could pay the servants their tips and go home again. The next time we have guests, I think we should leave a little loose money around so they needn't delay their departure in case they're as interested in going as Moore was. Well, he turned his hands to other forms of literature. I mentioned at the beginning of our talk the Grecian interest. There was a strong Oriental interest developing at this time too, and Moore contributed his part to it. In fact, he had such a reputation at this time that the very astute business firm of Longmans advanced him £3,000 for a new poem before he had ever shown them a single line of it. Now, this is a remarkable tribute to his talents as they were conceived of in his own time, because it was the single largest amount up to that time ever paid for any work, and paid sight unseen. This new work was to be an Oriental romance. Lalla Rookh is the name of it. Moore worked on it for 4 years, and it was one of these luscious things filled with references to the East in great profusion, filled with all sorts of sentimentalities and brilliant pictures of the East, of Eastern struggles, women, moonlight, waters, knights, Turks, all this sort of thing. And it had went over with such an acclaim that over 20 editions of this work of Moore's, which is now all but forgotten, were published. In fact, Hazlitt said that it might have been just as well had he not bothered to work on it. And then on the other hand, Hazlitt also said that if it is not a great poem, it is nonetheless a great work of art. It's extraordinary, this man's career in London. He was the friend of Byron. He was the friend of Washington Irving. He was a man of whose poetry Shelley said, "I acknowledge myself to be inferior to his best work." Rather astonishing to us today. Oliver Wendell Holmes contributed a poem to the Boston centenary celebration of Moore's birth. And Frederick the Great was proud to give him a decoration. This is the man of whom we talk today, and of whom we wonder, was he an Irish poet at all? Or was he a popular English romantic, a minor romantic poet of the day? Hazlitt tells us that he was one of the greatest satirists ever to have written in the English language, although most of his satirical verses were occasional verses and they may lose their point for us today. In fact, they get lost in all the detail. Well, his home for 35 years was at Sloperton Cottage. And this became such a tourist point. Tourists from the continent, after all, Heine, the German poet, said Thomas Moore is the equal any day of Lord Byron. It's the most phenomenal reception he had in his own time, this young lad from Ireland. He was personally attractive too, a very handsome man, as well as a very devoted father, husband, and whatnot. Not a Lothario, but a handsome man and a popular man. He had great personal misfortune. He and his wife had 5 children, 4 of whom died before they were out of their teens, and the last of whom died 6 years before Moore's death. As a matter of fact, died in the same year in which Moore's favorite sister died. And these 2 deaths, coming so close together, on top of the loss of all their other children, left Moore rather a physical and more or less a mental wreck 6 years before his death in 1852, almost 73 years old. Well, now, is he an Irish poet or not? Is he the bard of Ireland? I've given you a quick and brief review of some of the high points of his life without ever mentioning anything in connection with Ireland. We must remember that he turned his back on Ireland at the time of the United Irishmen, of Wolfe Tone, of Robert Emmet. And while former colleagues of his were hanged, drawn, and quartered for their rebellion, Moore was away in London, writing and entertaining the lords and ladies of the empire. Some people have said that he sold his nationalism, that he fled Ireland, that he escaped all of this, and his only interest in Ireland was to make a living. I think it's a very harsh criticism and not at all a fair one. On the other hand, it is true that his interest in Ireland was of a different sort and not a political kind. He refused even when Daniel O'Connell asked him to stand for Parliament. He refused to run for Parliament. He was a writer and, some people say, an exploiter of Ireland. That he hit a vein of sentimental interest in Ireland that coincided with the romantic taste of the times, and therefore he was able to be popularly Irish, make money at it, and suffer no danger for his interests. These things, I think, are cruel, but they do raise the question, was he really Irish, or was he simply an exploiter? Well, let us turn to some of his Irish poems. One of them, which seems almost autobiographical, is this particular one, Dear Harp of My Country, in which he says these lines, In darkness I found thee, the cold chain of silence had hung o'er thee long, when proudly my own island harp I unbound thee, and gave all thy chords to light, freedom, and song. This is, as it were, his apologia, his defense before the world for what he did with his Irish melodies. And in these melodies, many critics have realized that he brought English song, because these are English song to a new height that it had not experienced since perhaps the songs of the 17th century. And he did this because his poems by themselves just do not stand up half so well as when they are allied to the music. In fact, he says this himself, I wrote these to be sung. And this, mind you, is the very criticism that is urged against him. because it is said by his critics that he rifled Irish airs and distorted them merely to capitalize, to exploit them for his purposes. Well, a very popular song of his, which perhaps is well known to you all, is the Meeting of the Waters. And here is one of the romantic illustrations for this of a century ago. There is not in the wide world a valley so sweet as that vale in whose bosom the bright waters meet. Oh, the last rays of feeling, of life and feeling, must depart ere the bloom of that valley shall fade from my heart. This particular song is only one of the many which beautifully marry words and music. The words by themselves are inclined to be perhaps a bit too saccharine, a bit too sweet, but tied with the air, they make that beautiful, liquescent connection that is the delight of many of these, and which has earned the accolade of the critics for their qualities as songs. Now, one that has a bit more patriotic association, perhaps, is that called the Minstrel Boy. Again, it's a pity that we don't have the music here for you, but it would take us just that much longer, perhaps, to give the music for all of these. The minstrel boy to the war is gone. In the ranks of death you'll find him. His father's sword he has girded on, and his wild harp slung behind him. Well, this sort of romantic appeal, you can see how easily it fitted into the tone of the early 19th century society, a tone that had been created by Wordsworth and Scott and others. And particularly, of course, if you make the parallel with Scott's and Burns's ballads and their interest in the Scottish border, then you can understand how this wild harp coming from Ireland would accommodate itself to the same interest. But Moore tried to awaken in his listeners and in his singers too, an interest in the past of Ireland, and many of his poems lightly touched upon an historical incident or situation. One of those tells us of the time in the 11th century when Brian Boru, having defeated the Danes, is enjoying, or his country is enjoying under his auspices, a magnificent period of peace and plenty. And he tells the story of a maiden who, in order to test, as it were, or visually to demonstrate to all, most dramatically, the virtue and peacefulness of that time, she is able to make a trip throughout the whole of the country from one end to another, unprotected, although she carries on that wand a beautiful gold ring, and she herself is richly apparelled, and yet no one offers her violence of any sort. So that poem or song many of you may have heard, "Let Erin remember the days of old." There are others in which he tries also to, that other one was "Rich and rare were the gems she wore." But then there were others in which he tries to recall the days of old. And one of them is, "Let Erin remember the days of old." And this also has a historical association, trying to recollect in people's minds the situation when Ireland, for instance, was free. Let Erin remember the days of old, ere her faithless sons betrayed her, when Malachy wore the collar of gold, which he won from the proud invader. So this scene sets that general tone for you, the recollection of the days when Ireland was free and haughty and proud, and perhaps a power to be feared in her own way. Well, if we recollect the plight of Ireland in the 19th century, perhaps these played their part, not only at home, but also in educating people abroad. It's quite true, of course, to say that Moore entertained lords and ladies who couldn't care less about Ireland. But he also found that his songs animated the Irish, who at this moment in Ireland were foregoing their own tongue, their own heritage of song and poetry, and were casting about looking for something that might take its place. Well, he gave them not only these songs, but one which you may not have heard quite so familiarly. This concerns Robert Emmet. This carries us back to his Trinity College days, when he was a student with Emmet, who was a year ahead of him, and when he was known to Emmet. And Emmet, remember, lost his life in 1803, at the very height of Thomas Moore's success, when he was on his way to Bermuda. But Robert Emmet as a figure haunted Moore all his life, and he wrote this poem. You remember Robert Emmet said, "Let no man write my epitaph, since no one understands my motives. Let no man write my epitaph," he said, "until my country is free." Carrying that spirit on, Moore wrote a song in which he said, "Oh, breathe not his name. Let it sleep in the shade, where cold and unhonored his relics are laid. Sad, silent, and dark be the tears that we shed, as the night dew that falls on the grass o'er his head. But the night dew that falls, though in silence it weeps, shall brighten with verdure the grave where he sleeps, and the tear that we shed, though in secret it rolls, shall long keep his memory green in our souls." And this we can't help but feel was his apology. And that brings us full round the circle, doesn't it, to the question, was Moore the national bard? Was he, in his own way, a patriot? Was he, in his own way, really independently Irish, and not just an Irish entertainer of the lords and ladies, if not of Byzantium, at least of London? Well, it raises the question, you see, of what function he fulfilled. Perhaps he educated slightly English public opinion, which grew and developed slowly during the 19th century to an appreciation of Ireland's rights. And perhaps, too, he gave to a people losing one culture and one heritage something else to remember.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.